Given sort of the nature of today's conversation, it's sort of been veering towards the philosophical and the esoteric and the existential, and I want to bring it back to real people with real lives who have real consequences. And in some ways, this is what my work is always trying to do. In my first book, I took on the romanticism of the national forest and environmentalism and the reality of labor that goes into the production and the management of the forest as a crop. It's harvested, it's sprayed, it's thinned, it's replanted, etc. And so in some ways, I want to do this similar thing with California and this idea that California and the Central Valley in particular is the breadbasket of the world, that it feeds the world, and that this is inherently a good thing. There's a certain romanticism about the food movement and what the food movement is able or is capable of doing for people, in particular for farm workers. There have been numerous struggles over the meaning of water rights, the allocation of water, the outsized influence of agribusiness, the unquenchable thirst of urban Southern California, the environmental impact on fowl and fauna. But I want to argue that at the core of this battle for water is the fight for racial justice and for agrarian reform. There have been a number of tomes that have been written about water policy, Norris Hunley's The Great Thirst, Mark Reisner's Cadillac Desert, and these continue to be stories about big men and big politics making big decisions for little people. But what all of these books do is that they ignore that the reality is the unequal access to land and the federal subsidizing of water are the mechanisms through which workers and farm workers in particular are exploited to unimaginable extremes. So what I want to do today is also take on this idea of this family farm and the small farm and this imagination that California is full of small artisanal farms, full of back to the land baby boomers and increasingly millennials that toil in search of the perfect microgreen or the perfectly pressed goat cheese. Yet in California, unlike the rest of the country, the small family farm is not recoverable because it never existed. We all know that nationally, sort of the size of family farms or the size of farms has grown while the number of farms has decreased. This was a process that was foreseen by members of Congress as early in 1902 with the passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act. It was an effort to resettle the West in small 160-acre tracts that would, in theory, populate the West with yeoman farmers of the Jeffersonian democracy type. And so these projects were funded, the Central Valley Project, the Shasta Dam, the canals and the irrigation ditches that were all built throughout California were funded with a specific purpose and a specific intent to resettle people in small family farms in an effort to create a more just, more democratic society. Now again, unfortunately, what federal government had gotten wrong was that this land was already held in large, huge, massive tracts, first by the Californios and then by the Anglos that eventually stole the land from them after the Mexican-American War. And so these individuals were not, let's say, willing to part with in giant tracts of land. And so what I want to argue today is something that Paul Taylor argued in 1970. This is that the fundamental reason, right, the fundamental underlying cause of exploitation of farm workers in California is land use patterns, right, and land holding patterns. And that is that they're held in huge corporate conglomerates versus this idea of sort of small family farms. Now, in case anybody wants to get this kind of, there is a such thing as history, and there are such thing as archives and documents, and unfortunately, Victor Davis Hanson doesn't know what either of those are, and so you can maybe argue that this is a bit of a different point of view, but then we're arguing about what are facts and what is reality. Franklin Newlands himself, the senator who proposed the bill, said, The object of reclamation is not so much to irrigate lands as it is to make homes. It is not to irrigate lands which now belong to large corporations or even to small ones. It's not to make these men wealthy. It's to bring about a condition whereby the lands shall be put into the hands of smaller owners. So it was a very specific design for the 1902 Reclamation Act. And in fact, there was seen, even Theodore Roosevelt, who in a speech that he gave to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, alluded to the fact that this law was in effect an effort, right, ultimately to stave off revolution, right? The revolutions that were happening in Latin America and other parts around the world were very much part of the conversation that was taking place in an effort to pass this law. So this got me thinking about a number of different things. And one, it was when I wrote the book about Oregon, about the Pacific Northwest, one of the things that continuously came up was that the opponents of the Farm Workers Union that was being formed in the Northwest consistently said, why are you targeting me? I'm a family farmer. Why are you targeting me? I'm a family farmer. They felt like this attack on their farms was, in essence, this sort of un-American thing to do in of itself, because the small family farmer was supposed to be the image, the prototype, the archetype of what it meant to be an American and what it meant to be a good American. And so as a result of this, I started thinking about what it meant to be a family farm and how its surface posited a hardworking family of generational farmers versus the salt-of-the-earth farm workers who just wanted to make a better living for themselves and their family. And this is when I discovered the Department of the Interior had already done that for me. In its landmark 1981 environmental impact statement, the Department of the Interior came to the conclusion that in order to be a family farm, the immediate members of the family had to provide the majority of the labor. So by that definition, how many family farmers do you know? Not very many. So this makes perfect sense, because the more we think about this, some of the largest family farms or some of the largest conglomerates in California are owned by a family. The J.G. Boswells, the Harrises, the Griffins, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, as this is reflective of California as a whole, in 1970, 8% of all farms made up 70% of farm receipts. Okay, so 8%, right, a very small amount of farms made up for the majority of farm sales in California in 1970. So the romanticism of the food movement tells us, well, this is when Alice Waters started, and Chez Panisse, and this microgreens, and small farms, and the artisanal farmer, and all of this has started to change. There's a book that was published mind-bogglingly to me by UC Press called Inside the California Food Revolution. There has been no food revolution. In 2007, 73% of all sales receipts came from 7% of farms. So while the California food movement and this idea, this notion that something has changed, that we've undergone some sort of radical transformation of the way that we get our food, is just patently false. It's not true. It does not exist. But the question is, why should we care about the size of farms, right? Who cares if it's 1,000 acres, if it's 100 acres, if it's 200,000 acres? What difference does it make? Well, this is when I found a rural sociologist in 1946 by the name of Walter Goldschmidt created a study between towns of Arvin and the towns of Dinuba. Right? And he used various different qualities of life markers to determine what the quality of life was in rural communities. And his study, called As You Sow, found a negative correlation between the size of the farm communities and the sizes of farms and the community conditions. He found that Arvin, which was surrounded by large-scale growers, had lower median income, higher rates of poverty, poor rates of civic engagement, and that the town of Dinuba, which had smaller farms surrounding the town, had a much livelier, more impactful, more civically engaged community. And so those numbers of Visalia, Merced, Fresno being in the bottom 200 or whatever, in the worst economic cities and bad for business, business was essentially a making of large corporate farms surrounding these areas. So Walter Goldschmidt, unsurprisingly in the 1940s, was drubbed out of his position. His study was buried and was never published by any major journals. But nearly 40 years later, the man to his right, or to your right, to his left, a professor by the name of Dean McCannell, who I had the pleasure of interviewing and doing an oral history with last week, decided that he was going to go to UC, when he came to UC Davis, at the behest of another brilliant rural sociologist by the name of Isao Fujimoto, came to the UC Davis and decided he was going to do a retest of Goldschmidt's study. And so instead of doing it, and Goldschmidt's study understandably came under a lot of heat from sociologists and other social scientists because he had a sort of what Dean McCannell called a weak research design. And so he said, well, it's fine. Just because it's a weak research design doesn't mean it's not true. And so McCannell set out to replicate these findings, but instead of doing Arvin and Dinuba, he expanded the retest to 600 communities in the Central Valley. And what he found was Goldschmidt was wrong by degrees. He was way off on exactly how desperate these conditions were in these various different towns. McCannell also added a number of other different quality of life markers, infant mortality rate, teen pregnancy, et cetera, and he found essentially a curve, right? That there was a point where all of those markers started to go up, and that number was right about to 320 acres. Once farms got above 320 acres, all of those things started to crash precipitously down. And so this is, the work that I'm sort of trying to tell a story, right? I'm not a social scientist. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty of this kind of study, but what I want to do is tell the story of the people who lived in these valleys, who lived in these towns, these small unincorporated towns that Alex brought up earlier. And what I want to do is I want to focus on an area called the Westlands Water District. Now, the Westlands Water District is the largest water district in the country. It sits at over 600,000 acres, or roughly the size of Rhode Island, and is one of the, receives billions of dollars in federal subsidies every year in federal water. So the Westlands, I don't want to get into too much detail. Again, I'm sort of running out of time, but the story is that I want to write about this area. I want to write about what's happening here, and ultimately that any area that was supposed to get federally subsidized water was supposed to have them at 160 acre farms. Now, clearly, that's not the reality in the Westlands Water District. J.G. Boswell had 20,000 acres there. Giffen had 30,000 acres. Southern Pacific Railroad had 10,000. Shell had 10,000. I mean, these are all huge mass. Giffen had, at one time, Giffen had almost 100,000 acres in his farm. And so what I want, again, there's a number of different things that I can go into during the question and answer if you guys are interested, but what I'm really interested in is how people challenge the power of the Westlands, right? Because again, for all the talk of multiculturalism and plurality and all of these different things that we're talking about today, at the heart of all of this is power. You can't have plural relationships with people who control your well-being. It's impossible. You can't do it. And so I feel like, to a certain extent, Jan should have been on this panel, because at the heart of this really is Paul Taylor, right? And again, Paul Taylor was a remarkable man, a remarkable mentor to so many people, to so many scholars, and any of you who might be or have been or read or work on Chicano studies or study Mexican American history, he's one of the first people we read, right? He's one of the first people to write about it. Him and George I. Sanchez are sort of the godfathers of our profession. It was that Mexican people could be are historical actors, are important historical actors, and Paul for the longest time had been a champion of the 160-acre limitation, and he had constantly sort of pushed for the enforcement of the 160-acre limitation. Now, again, I have very little time left, but basically the short story is he meets a young man by the name of George Ballas, who was the editor of a newspaper called the Valley Labor Citizen in the Central Valley. He was a photographer, very well known. He sort of, takes up the mantle of Dorothea Lange and Paul Taylor in some ways. He chronicles the lives of farm workers. The photo of Chavez breaking his fast with Kennedy was taken by him, and this is he's not very well known, but he's a very important actor in the farm worker movement as a photographer. Now, him and Chavez, like Chavez and so many other people, had a disagreement. They had a falling out, and part of this disagreement centered around the 160-acre limitation. George had developed this relationship with Paul. Paul had sort of pushed George to kind of take the mantle. Paul was getting older. George needed to take on this mantle, and he did. And so he founded an organization called the National Land for People after him and Caesar sort of had a falling out about this. The National Land for People was a grassroots organization that organized farm workers, organized activists, lawyers, a whole host of various different people in order to try to force the federal government to enforce the 160-acre limitation. This is a fascinating story. I'm writing about it. I don't have time to get into the details, only to say that again, this sort of grassroots movement was very, very successful, and in fact made growers very, very nervous. And so growers started to do all kinds of sort of shady, hidden things, and putting 160 acres in their kids' names, putting 160 acres in their dogs' names, putting 160 acres in trusts and deeds and dummy corporations, et cetera, et cetera. While the UFW didn't take this movement seriously, the farmers most certainly did take this seriously. The growers took it very seriously. I did an interview with Maya Ballas, George's wife, and she told me the story about how they went to they did a tremendous amount of legwork into trying to figure out where all of these deals were happening and whose names these things were being put in. And so one of the names was a waitress at the local diner. And so they went to go see her, and they said, "Oh, where's your 160 acres?" And she was like, "I don't know what you're talking about. What 160 acres?" And then 2 weeks later, when they went back to try to disposition her, she's like, "Oh, I totally had forgotten about my 160 acres. I know what you're talking about now." And so they were the growers were doing all kinds of insane things to try to hide this relationship. And so I'm going to tell that story. And part of that story is the story of Arnold and Jesse De La Cruz, who were part of the UFW, who ultimately broke away because of the UFW's reluctance to engage this issue, and started to form these co-ops throughout the valley in an attempt to sort of shift the dimensions of power. They're ultimately unsuccessful, and I will argue in the book why that is. But that starts to spread to Yolo County, to a whole bunch of other places. So in the 1970s, there's actually a number of Mexican and Mexican-American farmer co-ops that are spreading up all over the valley. And again, you'll have to read the book to find out why it fails, right? And leave you guys wanting more. Finally, the last thing I want to say is that I was approached this summer by a group of filmmakers who were trying to do a story about farm workers and the drought and how the drought has affected them. Somebody mentioned earlier the no water, no job signs, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, well, how has this affected the farm workers? And I was like, you're asking the wrong question, right? It's not like farm workers were sailing on their yachts and swimming in their pools after the drought. Like this, before the drought happened, this is not a reality. And so one of the ways that I want to do this is to trace the history of particular communities that, like Professor Zaragoza was talking about. The one in particular that I'm looking at is Three Rocks in the Westlands Water District. The photos here are the shacks of, and if people who are not familiar with Three Rocks is, those of you who might know who Joaquin Murrieta is. Joaquin Murrieta went and escaped after his raids into Three Rocks. And so every year now, from Stanislaus County all the way out to Three Rocks, people reenact that ride. And if you live in the Central Valley and you've never done that, you should do that, especially those of you who ride. But these are the shacks that people lived in Three Rocks in the 1970s, and this is the shacks that people live in 2016, right? And Antonio Mendoza is the man over here in the far right, man I've been working with. He currently is sort of the leader of the grassroots movement there. What the Westlands Water District does, and I'll finish here, is that they pay about $30 an acre foot for federally subsidized water. Now, an acre foot, for those of you who are not farmers or from the country, is the amount of water that it takes to fill an acre of land 1 foot deep. So that's about 320,000 gallons, okay? So they're getting 320,000 gallons of water for $30. And during the drought, when they can't grow and be profitable, what they do is they sell it to the county to then sell it to unincorporated communities, right? And so unincorporated communities are paying for water that is federally subsidized at outrageous rates. That's not potable, it's not drinkable, you can't take a shower in it. And so these farm workers, Antonio would tell me that his water bill went from $30 a month before the drought to $240 after the drought. So they've refused to pay it. They're organizing, they refuse to pay it. The state has intervened and been shipping in bottles of water for these communities, which again is sort of asinine considering that the government and state water project as well is subsidizing the water that is being sold to these farm workers. So thank you.